Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Dateline, who really knows? With a man on the run and the media on a mission, what to make of the Edward Snowden story? Is he guilty of espionage, or is it a bad rap? Journalists in Egypt are under attack again, and Pakistan's new prime minister is not new to the job, but he's never dealt with media coverage like this. At its core, the story of the American whistleblower, Edward Snowden, is about information. How much private information a government is entitled to in the name of security, and what citizens should or should not know about that. It is ironic, therefore, that there is so much misinformation around this story. It became farcical when so many in the journalistic pack chasing Snowden ended up on the wrong plane from Moscow to Cuba thinking Snowden would be on it. The seat he was supposed to occupy went empty and ended up with its own Twitter account. And there have been distractions aplenty. Journalists have been judging Snowden's motives and ideology based on his flight path, the countries along the way, and the politics of the Correa government in Ecuador. When Guardian reporter Glenn Greenwald broke this story, he would have expected Snowden to be scrutinized. But could Greenwald have foreseen some of his fellow American journalists musing aloud and on the air over whether Greenwald should be prosecuted too? Our starting point this week is part global manhunt, part geopolitical blame game. It's the Edward Snowden story.
It's the story of Edward Snowden. Now we turn to what's been a big question for days.
Where in the world is Edward Snowden?
Edward Snowden is not the story here. It is not about him. It is about the information he released. And the sooner we can get away from this whole where in the world is Carmen Sandiego story following him to Moscow and Ecuador, the sooner we can get back to having the surveillance debate, because we need it. It's just ridiculous to see this in action.
News stories tend to follow an arc. This one is extraordinary. What began with a revelation, Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian exposing the extent of NSA surveillance, tracking mobile phone calls and emails of hundreds of millions of Americans, then became a story about the messenger, the whistleblower.
I think this kid's a punk. I think he's a coward, and I don't view him as a patriot at all.
Narcissistic young man.
He never graduated from high school.
When Edward Snowden surfaced in Hong Kong and moved on to Moscow, apparently destined for Ecuador, possibly via Cuba, we got a blast from the Cold War past. The focus of the coverage shifted to the places Snowden was going, the ideological company he was keeping. Larger, more fundamental questions went unasked, unanswered.
He's given the Chinese a huge chit in the game.
He has so much knowledge that's valuable to the Russians.
And he might end up in Venezuela. Good luck, pal.
The most important question is why in a country with the First Amendment does a whistleblower feel the need to leave the country in order to reveal government illegalities? We're supposed to be in the United States protecting the freedom of speech, and the Obama administration has even said it wants to protect whistleblowers. And yet here's a whistleblower who had evidence of government illegalities that violate the Constitution and statutes, and he felt that he had to leave the country and go to countries that would not cooperate with the United States in order to protect himself.
That official Washington would go after the whistleblower was unsurprising, but it was backed by a chorus of voices in the media saying similar things about Snowden and the governments who refused to hand him over, starting with China's. On June 24th, Beijing struck back through one of its official papers, the People's Daily. The voices of a few American politicians and media outlets have become truly shrill, it said. Not only do some of them lack the least bit of self-reflection, but they also arrogantly find fault with other countries for no reason at all.
It's not surprising that Chinese official media would criticize the way the United States government has handled this story and the way the US media have handled this story. I think they accurately see much of the media coverage as rallying around the government spying program and attacking the whistleblower. There's an added dimension because some of what The Guardian has reported impacts China.
Everybody in the world is a media critic, and hypocrisy is just part of the game. I mean, you'll find administration officials in the White House saying, you know, this is a welcome debate. We can talk these issues through. Well, the person who kicked off that debate is now, under charges for violating the Espionage Act, and the whole government is basically tripping over itself, trying to drag him back here to face a trial. So the amount of contradictions, ironies, hypocrisy, so on and so forth in this story is sort of legendary, I would say.
The day before that Chinese editorial was published, The Guardian's Glenn Greenwald appeared on NBC's Meet the Press. The host, David Gregory, asked him a question that to many summed up what is wrong with the coverage of this story in particular and Washington in general.
To the extent that you have aided and abetted Snowden, even in his current movements, why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
So I think it's a fair question to ask Glenn Greenwald, what is the nature of your interaction with Edward Snowden been? Have you helped him? But to premise it with, like, to the extent that you've aided and abetted this guy, why shouldn't you be charged? It's like asking, someone to the extent that you murdered your neighbor, why shouldn't you face charges? It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Gregory's question and the way he phrased it is a perfect example of one of the biggest problems with the American media. People like to talk about political bias in the media. The bigger problem of bias is deference to power. David Gregory and a lot of other journalists are going out of their way to look for ways to discredit Greenwald's reporting, Snowden's credibility, but they're not really doing the same with the government.
I'd almost arrest Glenn Greenwald, who's the journalist who seems to be out there.
Andrew Ross Sorkin, the New York Times financial reporter who is also a TV host on CNBC, talks about how he would almost arrest Glenn Greenwald. Then he apologized the next day.
My comment about Greenwald, I regret it. We make mistakes.
It's nonsense. I think they have seen the dividing line very clearly, that Glenn Greenwald is not one of us, and we must ask him questions that we would not ask another journalist, people like David Gregory. They're showing us, I think, where they come from.
Well, the question of who's a journalist may be up to a debate with regard to what you're doing.
It's a big mistake for the media to draw these kinds of distinctions between the mainstream media and Glenn Greenwald, or even an outlet like WikiLeaks that publishes information, because legally there's no distinction in the law between the New York Times and WikiLeaks. The Espionage Act covers anyone who publishes allegedly classified information. The law itself is not limited to bloggers, and it's not limited to Glenn Greenwald. And the mainstream media does what Glenn Greenwald did every day.
David Gregory is relatively new to Meet the Press. However, the criticism that the program speaks for official Washington rather than challenges it is not. After the 9/11 attacks, when the Bush administration was making the case for war in Iraq over non-existent threats to America, one of its preferred platforms was Meet the Press, where its arguments met little, if any, resistance.
It's also important for people to understand that this is a long-term proposition.
It is a platform for the elite to speak to a relatively small group of other elites, mostly in Washington. So when someone like Greenwald shows up on this program, it's inevitable that it's going to be somewhat contentious.
I think it's pretty extraordinary that anybody who would call themselves a journalist would publicly muse about whether or not other journalists should be charged with felonies.
Where an independent journalist of government power is sitting with journalists who I think are cozy with that power structure and are unsure about where his real sympathies lie. So it's not surprising, I think, in a way, that this unfolded as it did.
The longer this story goes on, the more governments get involved, the more hypocritical things become. China and its People's Daily really should look at themselves before calling out the U.S. media for the way they do their job. But American outlets would do well to consider the message from Beijing, which has some validity to it, rather than just going after the messenger. And they might want to take the same approach with Edward Snowden and his messenger. Our Global Village Voices now on the continuing coverage of the Edward Snowden story.
The David Gregory Glenn Greenwald exchange was a low point for journalism. Journalists are, as far as I'm concerned, required to be moral watchdogs, and that's what Greenwald was doing and continues to do by sharing with us a story that otherwise we would not have known.
Greenwald has clearly crossed the line in this story from journalist to advocate. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, other than he seems unwilling to own up to that and wants to hide behind the mantle of a humble investigative journalist, just reporting facts. He's trying to drive policy. He's trying to present the story in a way to maximize the outrage.
From the get-go, the American government, we knew that they were going to make this guy look like that he was the one committing the crime, when in fact they are the ones that are committing the crime by collecting your phone data, your email data. They want you to attack this man. And when it comes to the other countries, a lot of the media coverage from those other countries have been more truthful, because all we hear coming out of America is he's a traitor, and why is he choosing these other countries? He's choosing that other country because his home country is calling him a traitor.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Once again, journalists have been threatened and attacked in Egypt as supporters of Mohamed Morsi rally against calls from opposition groups for the president to step down. Backers of the Muslim Brotherhood and related political groups came together in Cairo June 21st for a show of strength following Friday prayers. The rally was billed as a non-violent protest. However, news crews from 2 private Egyptian channels, On TV and CBC, as well as the BBC's Arabic service, were reportedly attacked. Protesters accused the journalists of being part of what they call the corrupted media, beating them with sticks and smashing their equipment. CBC is the same channel that carries Bassem Youssef's satirical news show Al Bernameg. Youssef was among a number of journalists and television presenters shown on a protester's placard with nooses around their necks. Sharif Mansour, who heads the Committee to Protect Journalists' Middle East desk, said the attacks reflect the Muslim Brotherhood's inability to address the problem of anti-press aggression, even at a rally that was supposed to be about nonviolence. The hostile atmosphere continued into the next day, while hosting a call-in talk show. Azam Mustafa of the private Saga El Balad television station was told by a caller that he would, quote, come to kill all of you with machine guns. The campaign by Turkish politicians against the BBC and that organization's coverage of the protests there continues. This past week, the mayor of Ankara, Melih Gökçek, an outspoken member of the ruling AKP, went after BBC Turk journalist Selin Girit. Gökçek told his more than 700,000 followers on Twitter to spread the hashtag in Turkish, Selin Girit, don't be a British agent. He was responding to a tweet by Girit quoting protesters in Istanbul who were calling for an economic boycott to force their political leaders to listen. Gökçek tweeted that was evidence that Britain wants to bring down the Turkish economy. Prime Minister Erdogan had already taken on the BBC, accusing it and CNN of spreading lies about the protests. The BBC's global news director, Peter Horrocks, came back with this. The BBC is very concerned by the continued campaign of the Turkish authorities to discredit the BBC and intimidate its journalists. The government of Myanmar has banned this month's issue of Time magazine over a cover story that offended many of the country's Buddhists. The cover shows the controversial Burmese monk Wirathu, along with the headline, The Face of Buddhist Terror. The article within explores the rise of Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar as well as elsewhere in Asia, and how that has led to aggression against other cultures. Wirathu has been accused of stoking anti-Muslim sentiments by calling on Buddhists to boycott Muslim businesses and campaigning for laws to stop interfaith marriage at a time when violence against Burma's Rohingya Muslim community continues. The ban comes despite the easing of most censorship rules in a reforming nation whose former military regime closely controlled the media. Earlier this month, Pakistan's newly elected Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was sworn into office. It's his 3rd term. The first 2 ended badly, particularly the second, when Sharif was ousted by the military. The country he now leads has undergone huge changes. Among the biggest have come in the Pakistani media space. The government Sharif last headed in 1999 had a monopoly on television. This government does not, although it may come to wish that it did. In just over a decade, Pakistan's media have been deregulated and transformed. The explosion in the number of media outlets was supposed to diversify political and social discourse and strengthen the country's democracy. Things have proven to be a bit more complicated than that. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on the growing pains of Pakistan's media and what the new Prime Minister will have to deal with.
The last time he took office, in 1997, Nawaz Sharif made headline news on Pakistan's one and only news channel, the state-controlled PTV. Come 2013, and the Prime Minister's swearing in was at the top of every news bulletin being broadcast by Pakistan's 25+ private channels, from Islamabad to Karachi, to Lahore to Peshawar.
Now, the last time Nawaz Sharif and his Pakistan Muslim League Party was in power, the media had a very difficult time. Nawaz Sharif had very little tolerance for criticism, and he mistreated many media personnel. Now things are substantively different. There is a free media. It has been increasingly powerful in the last 10 years. The previous government, actually, for all its many faults and failings, was remarkably tolerant of criticism of the media. And I do not think that this Nawaz Sharif-led government would either engage in unnecessary muzzling of the media or will be successful if it does try to engage in it.
The media is very confident because it does see a legitimate moral high ground. And you see the example of the former military ruler Musharraf, who was once considered to be the hero of the country, but the way the media has been dealing with him lately shows that the media has become bolder. They are willing to ask the difficult questions that nobody dared to ask a few years ago.
Coverage of the election campaign in Pakistan was relatively open. One of the exceptions was Declan Walsh of the New York Times. 2 days before the vote, Walsh was expelled because of, quote, undesirable activities. The government never explained exactly what they were. He had been reporting from Islamabad for 9 years and hasn't yet been allowed back in. During a recent press conference, Prime Minister Sharif said he would look into the case. He seems to be taking his time. Journalists in Pakistan know where the red lines are. Critical reporting of the government, stories about extremist groups, coverage of the drone strikes are all tolerated. But reporting on the army and the intelligence service known as the ISI is dangerous work. Despite the limitations on their coverage, the young media outlets are making a difference.
The media has been instrumental in bringing about public awakening, and all of this has happened in the last 8 to 9 years. Media basically raised awareness. They introduced people to the politicians and politicians to the people in a way never before, and sometimes very, very critical and bitter, gave people the habit to question and to raise voices. It became a platform when the parliament became somewhat dysfunctional or lackluster. It became a court of public appeal when courts were not delivering justice.
I think the amazing thing that's happening in Pakistan these last few years is something that I call institutional equilibrium, which is that for many years you had these institutions like the army about which you couldn't say anything. You couldn't ask them any difficult questions, and if you did, you'd get in all kinds of trouble. We're beginning to see the erosion of that sanctity that is associated with different institutions. The media is now a part and parcel of the accountability systems that exist in Pakistan that help moderate the behavior of people that work on taxpayer money.
However, Pakistani media outlets have been known to abuse their new freedoms. Ratings-hungry TV anchors pander to audiences, and journalism often falls short. Dubious fatwas have been publicized on air, poisoning critical debates about blasphemy laws.
इस्लाम से खारिज हो गए उलमा इकराम का ये फतवा आपके खिलाफ आज जारी हुआ है.
TV host Maya Khan chased couples in parks, interrogating them about whether they were married or not. Last year, a leaked video showed 2 TV hosts rehearsing an interview with a real estate tycoon, working in softball questions and taking editorial advice from a government official. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court ordered the release of documents detailing nearly $2 million in kickbacks paid by the former government to journalists. These documents showed cash payments, hotel bookings, 5-star dinners, and flight tickets, all paid by the government. It was a sensational story, but coverage in Pakistani media was muted.
This list that came out, frankly, is just the tip of the iceberg. The corruption issue is a big one, starting from the owners down to the local correspondent. Whoever is on take, whoever is taking undue share of taxpayers' money needs to be exposed. I don't think that list has done that it has not even started the process.
The problem, however, is that most of these journalists who have been discredited have not taken a back seat. They have not disappeared into oblivion. These people are very much still on the political horizon. You still see them on the television networks. Is this the kind of attitude or behavior that would be acceptable on the international level? And if it is indeed, then it won't do much for the Pakistani media's future.
The list was really a smokescreen. The way in which favorable coverage is bought is not through payments or reimbursements to journalists. So the real way in which favorable coverage is brought by the government through the media is by engaging in contracts and business relationships between the government and the large media houses. And that's not a topic that's been discussed at all, and it won't be, because in fact, no media group has any interest in the exposure of that dynamic.
Pakistan is a country that's producing big news stories about politics, security, religion. One institution that is not getting enough coverage is the fast-growing, ever-changing media. As Pakistani journalists sharpen their pens and hone their prose dissecting the new Sharif government, they could also sharpen their focus on the media and turn their lenses 180 degrees onto themselves.
Business of handouts to the media from governments or from non-state sources need to be carefully monitored. If the media really does mean business, and if it does intend to clean out its own house, it should be subject to pretty much the same level of accountability and public scrutiny that it would like politicians to be subjected to.
More Global Village voices now on the state of the media in Pakistan.
The rapid growth of Pakistan's media has been a partial success. Partial because the editorial policies of these houses are less than professional. They basically depend upon the wishes of the owners of these media houses, which in turn means that it can be influenced by powerful institutions and individuals. This does not mean to say that media has not brought to the front many scams and many issues which otherwise people would have been unaware of.
The former government led by Pakistan People's Party is said to have carried out transactions worth nearly 200 million rupees in illicit payments to media organizations and individuals. The current government isn't likely to be any better, and Nawaz Sharif is a man who does not take criticism well. The media under Nawaz Sharif will face an even more hostile environment, while those willing to compromise their principles for cash will continue to make a lot of money. This is why the importance of alternative media institutions is paramount for a country like Pakistan.
Finally, the mainstream news media have been busy filling airtime and column inches with all kinds of stories about Edward Snowden. Snowden himself has remained relatively quiet, so the team at Rap News has suspended reality for a few minutes and handed the fugitive a figurative microphone with a fake Snowden giving his rendition of a 90s rap standard called Informer. It was originally performed by a one-hit wonder called Snow. These satirical online newscasts are produced by Juice Media in Melbourne, Australia. They're fronted by pseudo-anchorman Robert Foster. Rap News sees itself as an alternative news source for the news consumer with a sense of humor. This offering has attracted around 100,000 hits online. It's our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Hold on, we're picking up another feed, this time from Hong Kong. Glenn, it's me again. I got an update on what's going on.
Greenwald, we're gonna prosecute you for treason.
Your threats are no match for my shield, and you'll cower under the weight of words when I'm wielding my pen sword. By the power of Greenwald! Did you have an update for the people? Oh yeah, now, world, meet the brave leaker Edward Snowden. He's made a video to reveal his motives for whistleblowing. What's up, Edward?
Hey Glenn, what's up?
Yeah, what's going on here?
Me want big up the hot step of them Ellsberg and Manning, you know what I'm saying?
Yo, Snowden, they're gonna come around here looking for you today.
Word?
Word. busted.
Whistleblower, you know see Eddie Snowden them go blame. But leaking secrets out. The men that say Eddie Snowden done betray the USA. But leaking secrets out. Whistleblower, you know see Eddie Snowden them go blame. But leaking secrets out. The men that say Eddie Snowden done betray the USA. But leaking secrets out. Working for the men down in Hawaii. Finding me some baby and not PIV. But the Babylon for fire upon the civil liberty. So me decide to trade me safety for the sake of defend all me citizen privacy. If you see something say, something follow me and be whistleblower. You know see Eddie Snowden them go blame. But leaking secrets out. The men say Eddie Snowden done betray the USA. But leaking secrets out.